The river took her, and did not let her go. Cold clutched at her throat where the blade had kissed and slipped. The weight of her gown dragged while the current pulled, and in the dark she felt only water and pain, and the red wetting of memory. The walls of the hall were still in her eyes, torchlight smeared with smoke, banners drooping, a harp string breaking under a singer's hand, Rob turning, his crown knocked awry, his mouth shaped into a word he would never finish. There had been the smell of stewed onions and spilled ale and fear. And then there had been the river, as if the twins themselves exhaled, and the trident answered. Catelyn did not know when the hands pushed her from the narrow postern door, or if hands had. She remembered running along stone that shuddered with the footfalls of men, the breath of a cowled girl beside her. Then the knife that bit and the world grown suddenly bright and sharp as frost. She remembered the press of bodies in the passage, the reek of grease and blood, an old woman's tremor inside her own body where panic made her hands clumsy and her limbs the limbs of a stranger. She remembered the thin thread of her voice snapping. After. She felt only the rush and tug and the blind caress against her skin. Her eyes would not open at first, or perhaps they were open and the world was only black water. Stone scraped her shoulder. Reeds hissed. The river cuffed her against a fallen trunk and held her like a mother who is also a god. The god did not speak. It moved its long hands and turned her and pressed the bleeding places with its chill. She coughed and rolled, the night air lancing her lungs. Her nails found mud and roots. She hung there, half in the river, half out, trembling so that her bones shook inside her like loose teeth. Above her, the sky was a sheet of black iron scattered with filings. A willow's fingers tangled in her hair and would not give it back. Her throat was wet and sticky, and when she reached for the wound, the pad of her palm came away dark. A voice further along the bank said something she could not hear. Another answer. Low, closer. Reeds parted. Light shaped itself thin as a knife between the stems. The pale, rounded flame of a tallow dip, protected by a glass that had known 100 nights and 100 winds. The light paused, listening the way a hunter listens. Catelyn's chest rasped. What's in it then? A woman whispered. Plant or a person? Both, I'd say. A man's chuckle. The river's garden grows strange. Catelyn did not move. She could not. The willow hair pulled tighter. The small light wavered where it hovered. Trickle water went on with its prayer. The woman swore softly between her teeth and the light approached. It clarified a face, broad, burnt brown by years of sun and weather, eyes like deep pools that did not hurry. The woman wore a fisher's cap pulled low and a cloak waxed against rain. Her hands were rope-burned and her jaw was bristled the way a man's might be if he did not shave, though it was only the down of age. Behind her, the man was narrow as a reed. He had the look of one who laughed seldom and easily both, his mouth always nearly smiling and rarely trusting the smile. Leave her, the man said quietly. It's fray work, or I'm a merman. There'll be reward on any who pull what's left from the water, and punishment for those that don't know who to give it to. The woman turned her head as slowly as a heron sighting. Catelyn saw then the small scars at the corners of the woman's eyes, the lines cut there by squinting into wind, and something else cut there too. The decision to carry what is heavy because no one else will. Rewards are like fish, the woman told the man. You never count them before you catch them, and you never eat them if they stink. She pulled the glass from around the tallow and set it on a flat stone. Help me. I have a wife who scolds and 2 little ones off at Seaguard. May the stones keep them, the man said. But he was already shrugging off his cloak. And I've no wish to be tied in a fray's string and set to dry beside the gate. Then go, the woman said. I'll put this one back in the water and tell the river you were afraid of it. If I wanted scolding, I'd have stayed home, the man muttered. He knelt, and the 2 of them worked with fingers and whispered breath, and the patience that is born of river work. Willow twigs snapped. The woman's hands were firm on Catelyn's shoulders, and the man chipped quietly at the root that had caught in Catelyn's hair heavier than any pin. They took her weight, one shoulder, then the other, easing her onto the bank as if she were a net full of small, delicate fish that might break. The earth under her cheek was cold and smelled of last year's leaves. Throat, the woman said. "Joss, the bandage. We'll not be marching a lady to a septon tonight." She spoke the word lady, with no bow to it, and no irony. Only a naming, like naming stone, mud, branch. She pressed a folded cloth to Catelyn's neck. "Hush, hush," she told her. "Keep your blood. Words are costly tonight." Catelyn tried to speak anyway. Only air escaped, like a bird slipping through a hole in a net. She felt the cloth pressed tighter, and the woman's fingers curved like a harbor wall. She heard the man go and come again. The slap of water against a coracle's belly, the whisper of rope. Together, they lifted her. The woman was stronger than her frame promised, shoulders moving like a rower's. The man cursed under his breath, not at Catelyn but at the mud that sucked and at his boot, which seeped. They slid her into the coracle like a parcel to be smuggled, and laid another cloth at her throat, and one across her belly, where she did not know she bled until the warmth climbed like a thief. The woman took the paddle. The man waited and pushed them into the slow. The boat rocked and then steadied, and reeds combed Catelyn's hair clean of weeds and glass threads of algae. The willow receded. The flame in its glass jar went out behind them, as if the night had pinched it. They kept to the shallows, where the river spoke softly to the stones it had known since the first spring. The coracle scraped over a root that had dreamed it was a snake. Once, a light blinked in the direction of the twins, many lights together. Banners of fire hung on walls. The river made that distance a wall of its own. They came to a leaning willow with a scar in its bark like a closed eye and slid up beneath it. The woman's hut was part tree and part river, stitched together by patience and rope. The boards were warped in the shape of old water. There were tansy and rushes hung to dry from a beam, and nets mended and coiled, and a basket of river stones cleaned and sorted, by the thinking of someone who had spent long hours with small tasks. A cat watched them with its paws tucked under its chest, a small particular flame of attention. "You're a curse, Rilla," the man muttered as they lifted Catelyn again. "A curse that looks like a woman with fish-gut hands." "Kind," the woman said, and smiled a little. "Honeyed words will put us all at ease." She looked at Catelyn. "We'll keep you whole enough to quarrel with for a day or two more if we can manage it." They laid her on a pallet stuffed with old flax and new straw ghee. The hut was tight as a shell and smelled of fish oil, smoke, wet bark, salt, and something sweet herb. Rilla's hands learned Catelyn, the way a midwife's hands learn the shape beneath skin. She cleaned the wound with water that had been boiled and cooled, then with vinegar, working slowly and speaking not to Catelyn, but to the motions of her own hands. The man, Joss, brought a small iron pan and warmed it, and Rilla pressed cloths carefully so that heat seeped and pulled blood to where it could be made tidy. When Catelyn tried to shift, Rilla's palm held her still with a gentleness that was a command. "Should I fetch a hedge priest?" Joss asked. "Or a real one, if the seven aren't angered by our poverty?" Rilla shook her head. "I'll not risk the roads, nor the priests. It's healing work to keep a soul in its skin. They'd rather speak and bless. Besides, the lords are hunting answers. I'll not be offering them a lady." "Now, a lady?" Joss said, tasting the word. "She smells of salt fish and river mud now. So she'll pass a while as a stone." He crouched, squinting, then sniffed. "Not stone. Something else. Coin hidden in a loaf. Robin's egg in a bramble." Rilla's laugh was a soft snort. "Here's coin will find it when her gown dries." She knotted a band of linen around Catelyn's throat with the skill of one who has bound more than fish. She stood back with her hands at her hips, head cocked. The river catches nearly everything they throw in. Bodies, barrel hoops, words thrown in anger, houses in their way when the waters rise. It holds them a while, then sets them where they were meant to go. Her eyes returned to Catelyn. "We'll see which work you were meant for." They did not ask her name again that night. If they guessed it, they kept it folded inside the speech of their bodies, where it could not fly into ears, and be carried inland to stone keeps. Catelyn drifted in the shallow tide of fever and waking. In the waking patches she listened to the river. It hummed along the planks. It ticked through gaps in the boards, the way a thoughtful woman's nails might tick on a tabletop, while she counted. It spoke in a tongue of eddies and warps and hollow places. Rilla's cat settled into the hollow of Catelyn's knees and snored very softly, as if to shame the river. At dawn, pale light came green through the willow leaves. Rilla fed her a spoonful at a time, broth slicked with fat, the taste of carp and pepper and bay. Catelyn swallowed with effort. The swallowing moved her throat and set new pain flowering, but she ate because the shape of Rilla's frown told her Rilla would be angrier for refusal than for anything else. After, she tried to form a word. The room blurred when she tried, the walls coming closer, and then farther away. Rilla's hand was on her shoulder at once. "Hush," she said. "You'll salt your mouth with blood again. A nod if you can. A shake for no. That will be speech enough for now." Catelyn nodded, because she could. It was a small victory. She fell asleep and dreamed of sewing. She dreamed of small hands drawing needles through cloth, of mending stockings in Winterfell's great chair by the window that looked down on the godswood. She dreamed of stuffing the bone needle under her tongue because the baby was crying, and when she turned the needle had gone. She discovered it later stuck in the wool of her sleeve, as if it had crawled there to hide. She woke with her own mouth tasting of iron. For 3 days the hut clung to its root, and the river climbed and fell, never in a straight line. Rilla moved like the river, slow and unswerving. She rubbed goose grease into Catelyn's skin when the fever sweated the salt from her. She changed the bandages, each piece of linen folded with care, and kept as clean as a poor woman can keep anything. She did not speak of what had happened at the twins. Joss came and went at odd hours, his coracle a whisper, bringing news only when he could not help himself. "They burned an inn at the crossroad," he said on the second day, not looking at Catelyn. He spoke to the place where Rilla's knife was worrying at a rope that had turned hard as bone. "They hanged a man for giving a rider stale bread. It seems stale bread is treason now." "Then, bread has always been treason when your belly is empty," Rilla said. "They just learned to name it." She cut through a knot with a savage little sound of satisfaction and saved the piece of rope that might serve for something else. "What of the twins?" she added, as if she were asking about the sky. "What of them?" Joss said. He laughed. "They stand. The old man sits. They've nailed the doors they don't want used. They've pulled up the ones that lift the bridge. The water does what it always did, which is to flow where it pleases. Those that go through, go with permission, and a phrase gaze on their skin." He glanced toward the pallet, then away. "They say the young king's wolf was set on spikes, and his head has rotted already. They say the Kingslayer is wed. They say the North has no lord but a man who wears a bolt of cloth on his chest, like a promise to mend nothing." Rilla's knife paused. "They say a great deal." "They do," Joss said. He gave Rilla a bag of something that clinked like pebbles. "Hooks, as promised. I took them off a man who didn't need them anymore. He decided to be a soldier instead of a fisherman and discovered soldiers need less gear than fishers. Less patience too." He kissed 2 fingers and touched the lintel for luck, then nodded at Catelyn and left. In the evenings, when the heat lifted from the river and the willow leaves turned their pale bellies up to the breeze, Rilla's grandchild came by with a basket of eggs and a new bruise. She could not have been more than 10. She had a bird's quick head and wrists like reeds and eyes that did not expect kindness and were surprised by it anyway. "Lark," Rilla said, "this is a woman the river sent. You'll treat her like a basket of glass bowls." To Catelyn she said, as if explaining the bruise, "Her mother works at Seaguard's docks and sends her back down the river to me when the men are too drunk to notice. I told her to keep to the low grasses and sing to the leeches. They love little girls that sing and leave them alone." Lark smiled with half her mouth, which made her look like someone who had grown a secret inside her and was listening to it. She set the eggs down one by one on a folded cloth, as if they were little moons that might bruise too. "They say the river is taking the wrong things," she said abruptly. "They say it took a lady and left the men that hurt her standing in dry boots." "The river takes what it takes," Rilla said. She did not look at Catelyn. She wiped her hands and checked the bandage with an accuracy that had nothing to do with healing. And sometimes it returns what it cannot digest. Lark's gaze slid to Catelyn's. Catelyn tried to smile, and found that she had forgotten where that movement lived in her face. It came slowly, like a forgotten word. Lark nodded, as if that were proper speech, and fetched more water. By the 5th day, Catelyn could sit without the world tilting her off it. When Rilla propped her, she held herself like a bundle tied tight, afraid if she relaxed even for the space of a long breath, she would fly apart into what her grief wanted her to be. Rag and string and bone washed ashore. Rilla gave her a slate and a bit of broken chalk. "Words are salt," she said. "Keep them in the slate until you need them, and then lick your finger and set them free." Catelyn took the chalk between fingers that did not want to obey. It felt like a toy, a thing for Bran or Arya. The first letter she made was shaped like a fish, and not like the letter at all. She rubbed it out. She wrote one word with trembling care. "Rob." The chalk clicked in the hollow that the bee had, the belly of it where she had always liked smoothness, the way ink pooled in that place. And then she rubbed that away too, because she could not bear the visible shape of his name, and because the sight of it made the wound at her throat throb like a heart, as if her body were remembering her son and choosing a place to carry him. She wrote a different word. "Live." The chalk tip broke on the E, and she laughed around breath and nothing else. Something that might have been a sob in another woman. "Live is good," Rilla said, and with one brown finger drew a line under the word. The next time Joss came, he brought a roll of thin leather, supple and neat. Rilla cut a collar from it with a small careful knife and lined it with old linen. She pierced holes at the ends and threaded a length of fish line. When she had buckled it around Catelyn's throat and tightened it until it felt like a palm pressed there in blessing, she nodded, satisfied. "You'll keep it on when you're out," she said. "If you're out, it holds the wound and keeps eyes from it. You have the hair for hiding. We'll put it to work." Catelyn touched the leather, then wrote on the slate. "Thank you." She underlined that too. Then, after a moment in which the chalk hovered and would not obey her, she wrote, "My name is Cat." Rilla looked once, briefly, into Catelyn's face. "Good," she said. "We know how to be cats here." She wiped her hands and lifted the pot. "You'll stay until your legs remember you. After that, if the river says go, go. If it says stay, we'll find work for you. Nets, mending, standing quiet until the right time is in the room." Everything in Catelyn had been loosed from its moorings. A sentence could be a rope. A bowl could be a place to live. She nodded. Each day she stood a little longer. Her legs trembled with the effort, and Rilla never spoke of it. Lark would sit by the doorway and imitate the calls of the birds and half the frogs of the river and one of the weasels. She was good at it. The cat hated the weasel and loved the frog, and would bat Lark's elbow when she did the frog call, as if asking for more. The 7th day, moving as if the air were a river itself, and she must not trouble it, Rilla brought out a comb and a small knife. She combed the river from Catelyn's hair, each pull like a line drawn on a map that had been stained and folded and torn. Then she cut it. She cut it not as a lady's maid would, with a glance toward fashion, but as a woman cuts hair that must be hidden under hoods and against wind. The hair fell to the floor and made a small pile that looked like a sleeping animal. Rilla gathered it and tucked it under the pallet. "For the birds," she said. "They make beds out of what we think is leftover." Catelyn watched her own hair cupped in Rilla's hands and felt a brief, ridiculous flare of vanity. She had liked her hair. Ned had liked it too. He had not said so often, but when she had been heavy with child and sour with the smell of everything, he had stooped to kiss the crown of her head as if it were a kind of talisman, and his lips had caught on her hair. She looked at what was left of it now. Short as a boy's, and thought hard and made herself set down the truth. The river had taken and left, and this was what it left. She would not mourn what hair was lost when there were other things to mourn. On the 9th day, when she could walk to the water's edge and back, Rilla said, "We'll take you out at dusk. Not far. You'll learn the river from the boat instead of the pallet. The first lesson is to keep the paddle quiet. The second is to keep your head down. The third is to wait. It's the last lesson in most things." Bow. The coracle rocked and knew her weight as if it had been waiting to. Rilla's hands moved steady as a heartbeat. Lark, crouched in the prow like a small carved figurehead, leaned forward to touch the water with one finger, and then licked the finger as if to taste whether the river was in a mood to bite. The willow leaves brushed them a blessing. They kept to the shade. The twins were upriver, squat and stubborn. Smoke lay on the horizon like distant mountains turned horizontal. They passed the snag where Rilla's uncle had drowned 3 summers ago when he had boasted there was no river under the river that could pull him down. They passed the place where Rilla swore the river had twisted around and doubled back on itself and pulled all the frogs into a round bowl and held them there for a day out of mischief. Catelyn listened. She learned the river's faces, the bright one with teeth, and the dull one like pewter, and the one that pretended to be asleep, so that boys would kick at it and fall in. At the reed bed where the little fish flickered like small chips of coin, Rilla stopped the boat with a thought rather than emotion. She glanced at Catelyn and then flicked her chin toward the bank. In the shallows, a pair of men stood with polearms, bored and mean. They wore fray colors as a butcher might wear an apron. They were young enough to still be proud of how ugly cruelty can look on a face. "Crake Hall," one said and spat. "Crake Hole." Crack. He laughed, pleased with this, and tapped the flat of his blade against his palm. "We'll find someone," he told the reeds. "The old man wants the ones that slipped. He'll add a penny for every bit of hair we bring to prove a head was attached to it once." "I don't like the river," the other said, frowning as if the water were a map he could not read. "It looks back. It can't." The first said, "It hasn't got eyes." "It does," the second said stubbornly. "My sister told me when we were young, if I threw a frog and laughed, the river would see and tell the mother at the seep tea. Then my mother took the stick to me and told me the same thing. The stick knew too. Your sister is a liar, your mother is dead or a whore, and your stick is brown," the first said, and then laughed at his own boldness and yawned. He liked the sound of his voice. Rilla's breath did not change. She lifted the paddle and laid it in the boat and let the coracle drift backward through a thickening of reed. She could have been sleeping with her eyes open. Catelyn sat very still. She felt her own heart beating in her throat as if it could not find its way back. Lark's hand found the hem of Catelyn's skirt and held on, the small knuckles sharp as a bird's toes. They slipped away. The reeds closed behind them with a sound like pages rubbing. Once they were in the willow shade again, Lark let go and leaned her cheek against Catelyn's knee. A gesture so small and so human that Catelyn had to look up at the leaves so that her eyes would not release more salt water for Rilla to scold. "Lessons," Rilla said after a time. "The river keeps its secrets if you ask it the right way." Catelyn nodded. The leather at her throat held her head in the world, a tether to keep it from floating away. She thought of the boys with polearms and their sticks and their sisters and mothers. She did not think of pulling their hair. That night, when Joss came, he brought more than hooks. He brought a rumor the way a man brings a fever and cannot help it. "They're saying some of the Northmen made for the sea," he said, his face lit from below by Rilla's small lamp, so that he looked like a carved figure in a temple. "They're riding for White Harbor and there are ships waiting. Others broke toward the necks, and if the Crannogmen fancy them, they'll not be easily found. They say the blackfish took an arrow and then 10 arrows and then none at all, because he isn't a fish that bites a hook twice. They say." He hesitated, then continued because silence would be a stone heavier on his ribs. "They say the Lady Catelyn's body was thrown into the river for the fish, and there it stank until it stood up and walked. They say—" Rilla slapped the table with her palm, a sound like a paddle hitting water. "They say the moon eats geese," she said. "You've brought the river enough of other people's words. Feed it your own fish." Joss grinned because he must. "It's not my moon," he said. He looked at Catelyn then, openly. A long look that measured and weighed and found something, and put it down without naming it. "The river returns what it can't keep," he said, softer. "Sometimes it returns it wrong." Catelyn lifted the slate. "My work is not done," she wrote. Then, after a moment in which she remade a letter twice because her fingers shook, she added, "I am not done." Rilla turned the slate to look at the words as if they were a fish she wanted to be sure of. She nodded once. "Then don't be. But you'll do the work with care." The days found a rhythm that masked itself as apathy. Rilla taught Catelyn to mend nets, and in the mending there was peace because ropes and knots obeyed a grammar she understood. Threads crossing threads to make strength, not beauty. It was the same lesson as marriage and the same as house building. Every knot wants to be what it knows how to be, and every hand must learn to tell that not the truth. Lark would bring gossip like minnows, and sometimes a loaf that had ridden a day in a boy's satchel. Catelyn listened to it all, and did not let her grief eat every word. When she slept with her hand wrapped in the net, as if holding something that would hold her. It could not last. The river taught her that too. One morning when the mist lay on the shallows like a forgotten sail, and the willows had dressed themselves in spider silk beginning to glitter, Lark came running. She did not stop at the doorway to wipe her feet. She did not remember to make herself small. She flung herself onto the pallet, breath scouring her throat, and grabbed at Catelyn's hand, the one that held the needle. "They're coming," she whispered. "With dogs." Rilla did not ask who they were. She lifted the corner of the pallet and pushed the hair that she had saved there into her apron pocket. She picked up a small bundle that had been waiting under the bench for a week and set it in Catelyn's lap. "Boat," she said, and in that one word there was everything. Preparation, resignation, fury, love. They slipped into the water that had not yet chosen a color for the day. Rilla's paddling was a kind of thinking. Catelyn watched behind them where the willow shadow widened and then narrowed, as if it were breathing. The dogs burst into view on the bank, their bodies the color of mud, and their mouths the color of meat. They were led by men with that same mean boredom. The man in front wore his hair oiled into tight current curls and had a smile like an unlit candle. He stopped at the tree and looked at the hut and the river and said nothing. It was the kind of silence that other silences listened to. Rilla drew the boat into a wall of reeds so thick it might have been woven by women with a desire to keep their daughters. The boat rasped, then was still. A dragonfly hung above Catelyn's hand, and for a stupid, impossible moment, she thought if she blew it would turn into a thread of smoke and leave the world. The dogs on the bank bayed and then were quiet. The man with oiled hair stepped into the hut. Rilla's mouth made a hard, small line. Catelyn could see him through a slit between leaves, his careful steps, and the way he lifted a pot lid with his fingertips, as if heat were beneath his dignity. He came out, stooped, and looked at the river. He looked for a long time, the way a man looks at a girl he has decided to buy. Then he spat and said to his men, He sounded annoyed but not angry. The dogs were disappointed. They ransacked the little place, and the ransacking was not rage, it was routine. The stool was broken to see what it hid inside, though it hid nothing. The pallet was slit. The basket of sorted stones was kicked, and the stones rolled and knocked and made a small, senseless music. The cat ran and sprang for a root and held there with its claws, eyes green and huge. Lark made a sound deep in her throat, a fury that had to be small because she was small, and Rilla put her hand on the girl's head and pressed gently until the fury lay down. When the men finished, they left. The man with the oiled hair turned once more at the water, as if expecting it to throw up a fish with a locket around its neck, but it did not oblige him. The dogs trailed after, reluctant to confess that they had failed to be the thing they were. After they were gone, Rilla pushed out of the reeds. When they came to the doorway, the little place looked as if weather had sat in it and decided to stay. Rilla stood and looked. She did not cry. She touched everything once, as if to make sure it was ruined. Then she picked up the cat. "We'll live elsewhere," she said. "A willow is a willow everywhere along the river if you learn its bend." She looked at Catelyn. "You cannot stay anymore. The river wants you to move. I can hear it. It's rattling sticks." Yes," Catelyn wrote on the slate. "Where the hungry go," Rilla said. "Where the angry go. where those two things are the same. There are men in the woods who do not want the phrase to sleep. They follow banners they found on the ground and carry them like fire that smokes. They are not priests, though one of them is one, sometimes. They hang men with care and with sloppiness both, and they call it justice. The river gives them paths and gives them bodies, and they have learned to listen as you have learned. Go there if you like. Better, go where your work is. You know where it is. Then, the letters came smoother now. My daughters, Catelyn wrote. She set the chalk down and pressed her palm on the words. Arya. Sansa. Rilla read, and her face did something that only women's faces can do. Calculated the measure of another woman's love, and found its weight, and did not judge it for being heavy. Daughters go everywhere, she said. They slip like eels and stick like burrs. If they are alive, where they wish to be, and where they must. Find them if you can. Find those who know who knows. Don't run to Stone. Stone is where the men will go first. The thought of River's Run made Catelyn's body lean in that direction without her consent. Brynden would know what to do. But she knew how many eyes watched those walls. She knew how quickly a raven could be made to tell truths to the wrong ears. She rubbed the chalk off the slate with the heel of her hand. The slate plastered her with dust. The cat sneezed. Joss came when the sun was a coin sliding behind fingers. He took in the ransacked hut and whistled low through his teeth. They'll call it a search, he said. They'll call it that, Rilla agreed. They'll say they were very thorough and very clever, Joss added. They will, Rilla said. They'll be right about one of those, Joss said, and smiled his long, nearly smile. He set an oilskin bundle on the bench and unrolled it. Inside lay a folded piece of scuffed kid, leather the size of a man's hand, and a small purse that clinked, and a longer thing wrapped in cloth. The long thing was a knife. It was not a soldier's knife, and it did not want to be fancy. It was a clean piece of steel, and a handle wrapped with cord that someone had done while thinking about the ways one might grip it in winter with stiff fingers. A man gave this to me to pass along to a woman who needed to remember that a hand and a blade together are a head, Joss said. He said a lady would come and he'd not live long enough to be there when she did, so he put the knife first. Catelyn looked up sharply, the world narrowing down to a point the size of the knife's tip. It was a man who called himself Little Willow, Joss said. A name a man gives himself when he would like to be ignored by a king's scout. He had a black fish painted on the belly of his boat, where no one sees, for luck. He said to tell the woman that the river would slake and starve and slake and starve, and you must learn to starve well, and then he laughed because it sounded like a riddle he would never solve. He died of a coughing fever that took him fast. I fed him fish stew because it's all I have for men dying and men fishing both. Then, Rilla made her little snort of sorrow that never became more, because food was burning, or rope was fraying, or the river needed a paddle. Catelyn took the knife. It settled in her hand as if it belonged to a longer hand that continued up her arm and into her shoulder and to her heart. She buckled the purse into the waist of the dress that used to be a lady's and was now a garment a woman wore to move unseen. She put the kid leather packet in the inside of her cloak. It held a slate folded of sorts, thin pages of oiled parchment for messages that must travel damp, a stub of charcoal, a fishhook bent to hold a twist of hair. Boat at dusk, Joss said. I'll take you as far as I can without my fear-growing legs. After that, you float. They set off with few words. Rilla pressed a bundle into Catelyn's hand that held food and the leather collar's twin. Lark was solemn with the severity of children forced to practice bravery. She had braided a rush ring. She set it in Catelyn's palm. For luck, she said, or for keeping midges out of your hair, or for losing and then knowing where you were when you lost it. Même so. Catelyn put the rush ring on the thumb of her right hand, where it was too large and threatened to slip. She tied it with a bit of fish line to keep it honest. She pressed her forehead briefly to Rilla's, and Rilla, who did not do foolish things, allowed it. The river pays its debts the way men do, Rilla said into Catelyn's skin, slow and with grumbling. But it pays. They slid away from the willow that had been roof and door. Night was a violet bruise that did not fade. The land was a darker ribbon along the edge of a darker cloth. Joss did not speak. Neither did Catelyn. When they reached the fork where one branch ran toward Seaguard, and the other slid along toward the green fork, Joss laid his paddle across his knees and breathed out. "Here," he said. "I turn back and pretend you were a log that bumped my boat and made me swear. Up there," he lifted his chin, "is a ruined sept where the choirboys are frogs now, and the altar is a table for a fox family. People who do not wish to be counted count themselves there, or they move on. Some go toward old stones, some toward Blackwood, where the trees argue with swords. If you are meant to find anyone, you'll find them. If you are meant to be found, you'll be found. I hope for the first more than the second." He paused, and then, with that same rare gravity in him that Catelyn had seen only once, when he had tightened the bandage that first night, he touched his fingers to his brow and tipped two toward her. "Lady, or not lady. River, don't let them use your water for washing their knives." Catelyn wanted to speak. She wanted to set a sound in the air that would lay a blessing on their small lives. A thing as bright and ordinary as a coin. She could not. She nodded not once but twice. It would have to be enough. Joss pushed her coracle with a brief hard shove into the line of the current he wanted, and then turned and ghosted away. She drifted. It was not surrender. It was a kind of listening. The stars opened one by one to watch her, attentive as midwives. The frogs took up an antiphon from bank to bank. The water had its small hands on the coracle's skin, and therefore, on Catelyn's bones. She felt a moment of light-headed joy, not as a betrayal, but as a balance returning. She was alive. The cost of it would arrive with the next dawn and every dawn after, and she would pay it. But for now, the coracle made a sound like a woman shushing a child, and the rushes parted, and the smell of mint rose where the paddle had crushed it, and the night said, as clearly as a voice in a room, that it was good to go on. Near the ruined sept, the land lifted a little. The sept had been white once, and the white showed through where soot had not finished its work. The window that had been rose was a gap now that let the night look straight through, and in it the outline of a tree had taken root and made itself across against the sky. Catelyn let the boat nose up against stones that had fallen into pilings and tied it there with the knot Rilla had made her practice until she could do it with her eyes shut and her hands behind her back. A shape slid out of the nave's mouth, either a man or a shadow that had learned how to carry a bow. "Come easy," the shadow said, with a humor that had not been permitted to die. "The mother here lost her children and holds no grudge against those that borrow the night." Catelyn put her foot on the stone and felt the weight of the world return. She did not stumble because she would not. The shadow came forward, and he was a man. And the man was young in the way men who have lost everything are young. His face stripped to bone and a kind of clarity. He wore scraps of different loyalties stitched into a coat that answered only to his body's need for warmth. His bow was strung. He had notched an arrow for politeness and left the string slack for mercy. He looked at her throat in a way and then back, as if deciding whether to ask the wrong question. "If you are selling anything, it is the wrong market," he said. "If you are buying, you're too late. All the hope was sold last week to a man who said he could make it run uphill. He was a poor merchant and poorer liar. He paid in prayers." Catelyn touched the leather collar and made the smallest sound she could, a fern of breath. The man's eyebrows went up. "Right," he said, answering his own notion. "Mayhap you are not selling and not buying, but carrying." "What? I wonder." He considered the night around them, sniffed the oldest trick, set something aside inside himself, then made a small motion. "Come, eat what we pretend is dinner. Heat enough to remind your hands what blood is for. After, you can make your bargain with whoever is listening tonight in the broken choir." They were three around a fire small as a cupped hand, set in a hollow and tamped with care. They had done everything to prevent it from telling more than it must. The other two were a woman with hair shaved close as if to wrong-foot a man's hand, and a boy whose eyes had once been merry and now were bright for other reasons. They were both bandaged in at least 3 places each, the sort of mending that is never finished. "Rowan," the man said, touching his breastbone. He nodded to the close-cropped woman, who touched her own in turn. "Berry leaf. Don't laugh," He did. He jerked his chin at the boy, who shrugged. And look where he is now. Arrow through the calf for laughing at mothers. Never laugh at mothers. The boy smiled despite himself. I laughed at the name, he protested. It's my name, the woman said, and smiled too, cleanly. And I chose it to shame those that think choice is a luxury. Her eyes came to Catelyn. And you? Catelyn put a hand to her throat. She reached for the slate and charcoal in her cloak, then thought better and held her hands open. She looked at the fire. She put her palm above it, where the heat could speak to the nerves. Rowan followed her gaze and shrugged. No one here's a tailor, he said. If you came to have your throat sewn closed, you came to the wrong ruin. If you came to be listened to without interrupting, we can do that. Then too. She wrote then. I survived, and showed them the words. She hesitated and added beneath. I need words from this land. I need to hear the ones that matter, not the ones men tell themselves to sleep. She rubbed that out, embarrassed by how large it sounded, and made something smaller. News. Phrase. Any Northman. A girl with a sword. A girl in a tower. Rowan bent, squinted, and nodded slowly as if music had tuned itself. Ah, he said. Those girls. Berryleaf made a small sound that might have been approval. Girls are hard to keep, she said. If you find a way to do it, tell me. News is what we have that no one pays for and everyone spends, Rowan said. And with the care of a man measuring out spice, he told her a little, and then more. He told her of villages peeled of their bark and left to dry, of a lord who had switched boats midstream and found the current complicated, of wolves howling at daylight because the night was too crowded, of bracken men and blackwood men circling each other like stags, antlers down and pride up, of outlaws with good reasons and bad ways, of a rumor of a red woman preaching near River Run that the river was blood when it wanted to be, of Seaguard hoarding and Harrenhal echoing, and the twins thick with guests that were never fed enough. And the girls? Catelyn wrote. One was seen near the river, Rowan said simply. She had a dirty face and a mouth like a knife, and a man with a burned face walked beside her as if they were strangers and as if they were kin. A boy tried to take a bit of sausage from her hand, and she put him on his back with a trick I liked. That was before the twins spat arrows. He glanced up, measuring the pain his words would cost, and deciding she had coin enough. She slipped again into the world between wolf and rush. The other, he hesitated. There are whispers, a wedding cloak, a dwarf, a city of redstone, a bird like a crown floating on a river gone sluggish. Some whisper she wears a dress with chains stitched into it. Others say she holds a candle and walks the castle like a little ghost, and no one sees her because no one wants to. Catelyn's fingers tightened on the slate until the edges cut. The river hummed under the stone of the ruin, a long note. Berryleaf reached over and took the slate and set it down. Enough, she said, not unkindly. There is a time to listen, and then a time to keep the blood where it is. Rowan nodded. Enough. He stirred a pot with a stick and found only bones and water. He lifted it anyway. You'll stay here until morning, he said to Catelyn. Then go where you have decided to go, toward stones or trees. Both have teeth. If you ask me, and you are not, I'd say trees. They lie less. No. Catelyn lay near the reddened rock that had once been an altar where women had lit candles, and men had pretended to lead them in prayer. She watched the fire spend itself on small twigs, and then on ash glow, and then on memory. She thought of Arya with a knife for a mouth and a trick she liked. She thought of Sansa's hands, precise and careful, folding a cloth with more attention than the men in the room would ever give to maps. She thought of Robb's hair when it dried in the sun. It had been more brown than black then, and she had wanted to cut it because mothers want to cut everything and keep it. She thought of Eddard's voice when he had spoken of duty, which had been quiet because duty does not require trumpets. She put the rush ring Lark had made on the altar, and then took it back, because it was not the sort of offering the gods were owed. It belonged to a road. She dreamt that the river wrote its own name across her throat in clear water. and that when she woke, the leather collar was wet, but her bandage was clean. In the morning, she went east for a time with Rowan and Berryleaf and the boy, who grumbled but carried more than his share. They taught her the ways of stepping without letting the leaves complain. They taught her which berry was named for its honesty and which for its lie. They shook a grate of twigs and made a rabbit agree to die for breakfast. They showed her where outlines of houses remained charred on the earth like shadows, and where a woman had buried her child in a garden and put lettuces around it for a mark, because stones were sparse and soldiers hungry for it. They saw men hang. Berryleaf pointed them out as if they were stars. "Our work," she said once, with no pride in it. "We are clumsy surgeons. We cut where we see rot and miss the places the knife should have gone. But it stinks a little less after." Catelyn did not look away. She allowed herself neither the mercy of pity nor the ease of hardening. She counted faces because counting was work she could do. One had the current curls of the man by the willow. His smile had been taken by crows. She did not look for satisfaction. Satisfaction is a fire that burns what you need to build with. She drew the leather tighter around her throat and shortened her breath until it did not rasp. When they cut the bodies down and let them find the ground, she helped with the rope. And for a moment, it felt like mending nets. At the second camp that the not-quite Brotherhood used, only a ruin of a root cellar with tree roots like ribs, Catelyn wrote on the slate in a corner where the light fell, "Take me to them." She wrote, meaning the men who called themselves judge and jury in rag coats. She added, "If there is a woman among them who remembers the mother, I want her. If there is no woman, I will be one." Rowan read, leaned back against the wall, and let his head knock the damp stones gently. This was his way of thinking. It made a quiet sound, and then another. "There was a priest once," he said, "a man who made himself into a story, and then the story into a priest again. He gave a part of himself away to a friend, and then had less to give, and men made him into a flame because they thought flames tell truths. He went and didn't return. After, there was no one to tell the men that their own fear was a bad judge. They needed a hand. They made one out of air." He looked at her throat. "Or out of water. If you go there and show them yourself, they will be remade. I cannot tell you what shape they'll choose with your weight on them." "No." Catelyn wrote, "I need what they know. They know where the fear lives," Berryleaf said from the doorway. "They have made a map of that. It's not a good map. It's drawn in a hurry with bad ink, but it tells you where not to sleep." Catelyn crossed out "I need" and wrote "I will." She did not know what the verb would attach to. Will, she decided, was the verb itself. It took days to reach the wood where the outlaws nested thick enough to call it a hall. The wood had no name because names bring men with ink, and men with ink bring men with fire. It was birch and oak and beech, a pale-barked assembly that set its own light beneath its own leaves. The ground was soft with rot, and the smell of it went into your mouth and fed you whether you liked it or not. At the center glade they had made a place for speaking, a stump with axe marks and a circle of stones that had been collected from miles and carried because people liked to sit when they passed judgment. There were perhaps 20 there when Catelyn and her small escort arrived. Faces turned. The faces were every age men have when they are desperate. Some had clean scars, some dirty. One man wore a septon star hammered crooked. One wore a bit of chopped maester's chain like a collar for a dog. A few had kept their banners hidden and brought only the colors in their eyes. They saw the leather at her throat and the way she held her neck. They saw the knife at her belt and the slate at her breast, and the way she did not put her back to any tree, and yet kept near the birch that would let a man slide up behind her, only once. They saw the hair cut short, not because of a fashion but because a woman had scissored it and told the birds to line their nests. They saw a lady and a stone and a river and a mother and none of those things, because men see what they need to. "This is one who wants to be the weight," Rowan said, not loudly. "But a quiet voice in such a place travels. We did not invite her. The river did. I am not a priest, but I have learned to listen to running things. A few men laughed uneasily. The man with the crooked star said, "We do not use the river as a clerk. We have our writs and our reasons." "Then, your reasons hang very poorly some days," Berryleaf said. "And very well others," another man admitted, who had the look of one who had learned to be honest, because lies had left teeth marks. "I'll hear her." Catelyn stepped forward. She set the slate on the stump and wrote with deliberate slowness. "Children, women, small folk. You say you judge to protect them. How many have you counted?" She made the numbers like stitches. "How many protected? How many hung? What do you do for the ones you save besides leaving them alive?" There was a small silence, valuable and uncomfortable. Men shifted. A woman at the edge with a baby's cloth tied across her chest looked up sharply, her fingers stilling. The man with the crooked star frowned at the slate as if it had insulted him. "We take bread from some, give to others," he said. "We take grain from those that grew it under the lion's banners, and give to mouths that would otherwise be fed only by flies. We do what is to be done. What else is there?" Catelyn rubbed the chalk where a crumb had broken and written a tiny second dot on the eye shaft. She wrote, "We bury. We make lists. We tell names to their own houses. We send messengers with the truth when we have it. We set rules. We keep them. We do not hang children. We do not hang for stealing bread. We do not hang to quiet our fear." She paused. "We are not lords. But we set law here because there is none else." A murmur traveled the circle. Rowan's mouth was crooked in a way that might have been pride. The man with the crooked star looked offended, and then, to his own surprise, interested. "Who are you?" he said, and he peered to try to fit her into a story he had. "Because everyone is easier to judge inside a story. That you speak as if you carry a house on your shoulders." Catelyn lifted her hand to the leather at her throat and then let it fall. She thought of names. Tully is a river lover. Stark is stone that remembers the wind. Cat is a small shape that goes through places men cannot. She wrote, "I am a mother. It is a house. It is all the names." Berryleaf laughed under her breath. The woman at the edge with the baby lifted it and set it more comfortably against her breastbone. And for a moment the room was simply that, the smells of milk and wood smoke and old fear grown less. In the days that followed, Catelyn did not crown herself or seek to be crowned. She worked. She took the lists Berryleaf had scratched on bark. Names of those hanged, names of those spared, names of those small farms where grain had been taken and half returned, and turned them into something that could be read twice without becoming a lie. She sent boys who wanted to be men into the villages with instructions that were boring and therefore difficult. Find if the old are being fed, carry messages to mothers that their sons had died bravely, and to wives that their men had died foolishly. Bring back birth dates and grave dates. She spent a day in anger when a man with a braid of hair at his belt laughed at something a wounded girl said. She spent the next 3 days using that anger to make a chart of the roads where patrols had gone and the hours they preferred. She set a rule that no body was to be left hanging after noon, and if a rope could not be cut at night because of watchfires, then a prayer said would have to stand in for a blade, but the name was to be repeated and learned by someone who did not know it before. She found a boy whose letters were good and had him copy what she wrote, so the ink left the river later, on other hands, in other places. A murmured name reached her ear on the 4th day, a name carried by a man with a broken nose and a music in his speech that made everything he said sound like a joke even when it was not. "Brienne," he said, "a great cow of a woman. A sword taller than decency, a squire with ears like sails, a blue cloak the color of the sky in a story. She asked of girls as you do. She kept asking even after someone put blade to her throat to see if it would teach her a new question. It did not. She went toward the blackwood. The trees there are too proud for me." Catelyn turned her face inward until her body was a small room. Brienne. She had trusted the woman, foolishly perhaps. She had sent her into a world of wolves with only a knife and the notion of honor. She wrote the name on her slate and then rubbed it out, and then rode it again, as if she could draw the woman toward her with this repetition. She imagined the line of Brienne's jaw set against disappointment, and her sword carried as if it were both a burden and a justification for her arms. Between one night and the next, a decision grew in Catelyn like a bone knitting. "I am going to the Blackwood," she wrote to Rowan. He nodded as if he had expected that bone to set itself in that shape. "We have a thing in mind for the phrase first," he said. "They float their provisions downriver as if the Trident were their personal barge. Wood scows with grain for the belly that betrayed. We've been cutting ropes and letting their carts go hunting frogs. It's a jest. We need a blow that is not a jest." Catelyn looked at the lines he had drawn in earth with a stick, marking where a current faltered and where a snag waited. It was a child's sketch and a dead man's plea both. "There is a ferry," she wrote, memory reaching into a part of the river her feet remembered. Enoch's ferry, where the old ford was. "It runs at dawn. They've been using it for their men when the bridge is watched. The ropes are new. They don't sing yet, so men forget ropes sing at all. Cut them at the moments men do not notice the world singing." Rowan grinned, all at once boyish. "There you are," he said. "A mother's revenge, not blood. Embarrassment. I love it better." "It is blood," Barrowleaf said. "They will drown." "Let them swim," Rowan said. And then his eyes met Catelyn's, and he let the jest fall. "Let them swim or not. The river will decide. We will make them remember it has voice." Menorwanti. The preparation took a day of all the small careful things Catelyn had learned to love, because small careful things keep large clumsy ones from doing their worst. She chose 3 men who could move like herons and not like boars. She taught them the knot that looks like nothing until you pull, and then it becomes what it is. She timed the half hour before the dawn with her own breath, and the tiny, reliable noises of birds waking in concentric circles away from them. She put Lark's rush ring on her finger again, because she had tucked it in her cloak, and sometimes a child's offering is the only armor permitted to mothers. They went into water up to their thighs. It took the heat from them as if it were collecting tax. The ropes of the ferry were thick and new, as she had said, and smelled of tar and good intentions. The men in the ferry yard were still gnawing meat and boasting about a girl somewhere who had said a kind word to them. The world at that hour belonged to amphibians and men like her, who had learned to ask permission of amphibians. They worked their knives with the patience of a woman birthing. No hurry, no pride. The rope's heart parted with a sound like a word said in the wrong language. The second rope after. They did not cut it clean. They worried it the way mice worry a loaf. They placed a stick to hold its shape, so that the ferryman's hand would not suspect its betrayal until Waite spoke. They retreated to the reed bank, and there they waited in the wet, with the river at their ribs. Dawn came palely. Men came more noisily. They were fray men, thin with the rich man's habit of feeding his own mouth first. They gathered on the ferry with polearms and old jokes. The ferryman, pock-scarred and indifferent, spat into the water and tested the rope and found it good because he had not tugged hard enough. He shoved off. The ferry moved, obedient. In the center where water runs like a thought, no one can word. The hidden cut learned itself. It spoke. The rope parted with a pilgrim's sigh. The ferry did not capsize. It slid sideways and began to spin. Slow at first. Then with a purposeful jerk. Men shouted. Men tried to pole. The poles slid under, as if the river had taken them for eels. The ferry kissed the hidden snag that had always waited there. A stump like the nub of a tooth, and kissed it again harder, and the planks began to pry themselves apart out of a desire to be trees again. Some men fell. Some clutched each other, which helped if the one they clutched swam. Some snarled orders that the river could not hear. One tried to shoot an arrow at something, perhaps at God. The arrow went and was a fish's curiosity for an hour. Catelyn did not smile. She counted heads. It was a habit she could not unlearn now. She saw the pock-scarred ferryman reach for a rope that was no longer attached to anything and make a prayer that was an apology. She saw a boy barely old enough to be proud of the hair on his lip flail, and then find the rhythm of the water and go with it, not against, and so live. She saw a man with current curls go down because his boots were too fine and filled too fast. She saw it all. She bore witness to the river's law, and when it had been passed, she turned to Rowan and lifted a hand that meant enough. "Enough," Rowan said, and his voice had no triumph in it and no regret either. It was a clerk's voice, making a mark correctly. He looked at her with something that was nearly reverence and nearly fear. "You know this land," he said. "Not with your eyes, but with your ankles." "I have lived here," she wrote. She almost wrote, "I love it." She did not, because you do not say that in the hearing of men who would put it on you like a chain. She instead wrote, "I am going to Blackwood." He nodded. "Take the path that skirts the old mill with its wheel broken like a jaw," he said. "There's a house there where a woman keeps scraps of news in jars the way others keep preserves. She will ask you if you prefer honey or salt, and if you say both, she will feed you the truth." Then Tawal. It was a long walk and a short one, because distance is measured by purpose as much as by earth. The mill had been gnawed by fire, and then by rain, and finally by goats. The wheel lay like a broken crown on its side. In the house beyond, the woman Rowan had named sat at a table sorting dried beans into 3 piles. She lifted her head when Catelyn entered, and looked her over in one glance, and in that glance measured her hunger, her fear, her grief, her knife, her readiness to use it, her attention to detail. She nodded once as if adding a bean to a neat pile. "Honey or salt?" she asked. Catelyn wrote both, and the woman smiled very slightly. "Good," she said. "It keeps you from growing stale bread where your heart belongs." She set a cup of watered wine in front of Catelyn, and a heel of bread that was stale and good, and a dish of pickled fish that had the sharpness of truth. "Now," she said, "you want the story of a girl as tall as a tower, and the story of a different girl as small as a knife." Catelyn drank. The wine had a sour, sweet taste that made the throat remember it. It was made to swallow, and not only to ache. She nodded. The woman's beans clicked as her fingers moved. "The tall one passed through 2 days ago with a boy whose ears came before him," the woman said. "She asked for a lord she had never met, and for a sword she had never seen, and for a lady she had once held in a cell, and she had in her eyes a thing I recognized, because I have seen it in every mother who comes here. Patience built on rage. She asked too little for herself, and too much for everyone else, and that always buys you a certain kind of trouble. She went toward the Blackwood with the 7th hour, which is to say with hope that knows what falls in afternoon. She left me a word to pass to those who came after. She would make for a river bend where the ashes of old kings sit on a knoll and think about being stones. She said anyone who sought her would know the place because the wind there sounds like a child whispering a secret into a hollow log. Then, Catelyn felt something in her chest loosen and then tighten again, the way a knot does when you pull the right tail and then pull the wrong. "And the small one," the woman said, "you know already what she did not do. She did not die. She has that in her, the refusal. She goes where men do not, because she is overlooked by those who do not remember their own mothers had to grow them. She went north of here a day before you came, and then south by accident, and then west by design. She was in the company of a man with half a face who cared for her, and did not love her, and loved her, and did not care in ways that will take her years to straighten in her heart if she lives to see years. She is not near, but people like her are never far, because the world is full of corners." And now, Catelyn bent her head and closed her eyes for a heartbeat. When she opened them, the beans were in 4 piles, and the 4th pile, she realized, was for those whose names would never be said right and whose graves would never be found. She touched that pile with her fingertip and left it in place. "Blackwood, then," she wrote. "Blackwood." The woman agreed. She stood and went to the corner. She fetched a small wrapped parcel and placed it in Catelyn's hand. "For the road," she said. "Honey, ditol, alt, .on, a needle, thread, A thimble. You would be amazed where I have seen a life saved by a thimble. Then? Catelyn smiled with her eyes, because the collar made smiles awkward. She put the parcel in her cloak. It was light as hope. When she left, the woman had gone back to sorting beans. The sound of them was old and steady, and felt like weather. The weight of Blackwood walked itself into her feet. The Blackwoodmen had some pride left unspent. Their trees stood like opinions, not like supplications. Ravens spoke from the branches if speech could be made of hunger and impatience. The keep itself was not far, and it was more stone than timber and more stubborn than either. Smoke rose from its kitchen as if nothing had ever burned. At the edge of the wood was a clearing with an old mound at its heart. The mound had king stones set like teeth, dull and pitted. On the face of the largest stone, someone had carved, long ago, a deer or a boar, or a shape that had mattered to men who wore their hair differently. The wind slipped through the grass, and it did sound. Catelyn realized with an ache that felt like joy, like a secret told in wood. A woman stood by the stone with a sword across her back like a mercy. She turned when Catelyn came from the trees, and her face did the thing faces do when longing and disbelief collide. They scorch and then harden. Brienne's features were not lovely by any rule Catelyn had learned in her youth, but they had a rightness to them that made loveliness shy. Her eyes went to the leather at Catelyn's throat, and then to Catelyn's eyes and stayed there, refusing the cruelty of staring at scars. "My lady," she said. The words cracked. She looked as if she were ready to kneel, and as if she did not understand how to. Both and a small boy behind her stared with his mouth open like a fish. Catelyn did not let herself be the ghost in that moment because she would not steal it from the living. She lifted a hand, palm outward, a greeting learned at a great hall's door when a messenger arrives out of season, and then she stepped forward and put her hands around Brienne's forearm. Brienne flinched as if metal had grown hot. Catelyn squeezed. She nodded once. She had words on the slate and did not use it. She held Brienne's arm until Brienne believed in weight again. "It's you," Brienne whispered, hoarse. "They said you were thrown, and that thereafter." She choked off whatever else was in her throat. "I have been looking for your daughter." Catelyn drew the slate then, because some sentences must be shaped. She wrote Sansa and then underlined it. She wrote Arya and underlined that too. Then she wrote, "I am alive. It is enough to begin." Brienne's mouth trembled and set. "I'm not good at beginnings," she confessed. "I am better at standing." Catelyn managed a shadow of a laugh. She wrote, "Then stand by me," she added, because it was time to begin. Not with banners and vows, but with something smaller and more binding. There are women in the Riverlands who need a house that moves and is made of hands. We will build it. We will find my daughters inside it. We will not let our rage eat them before our enemies try." Brienne nodded. The nod was so simple it was almost a prayer. The boy behind her, ears like sails, shifted from foot to foot, and then remembered to bow. "Podrick Payne," Brienne said, and colored. "He is earnest," she added carefully. Podrick bowed again, earnest as a spilled bowl of milk. "My lady," he said, looking at Catelyn as if she were a tapestry that had come to life and would go back to being a picture if he blinked. "I have learned to kill a rabbit." "We will make use of all our skills," Catelyn wrote gravely. And to her surprise, Brienne laughed. A plain, strong laugh that made the ravens pause in their commentary as if to consider a new sound. They sat with their backs to the Kingstone and made a plan that was not a plan so much as a mood. They would go where the small fires were, not the big ones. They would pick at the place where the phrase cloth had been badly stitched and worry it until the seam came open. They would leave river messages for those who had river to them. Little leather rolls tucked in knots where only hands that knew the river's tricks would look. They would make a list of men who had daughters and remind those men of that fact at odd hours. They would measure where the Lannisters stretched their bread and cut it again carefully, not with a slash but with a baker's string. They would keep count. They would bury the count when the count was a body. They would not let anyone say the word revenge without also saying the word law, and anyone who refused to say the second would go back into the river. That night the wind made the grass speak, and the ravens argued and then fell asleep. Brienne kept watch for the first hours, her spine straight as a pole. Podrick snored softly, his ear tips illuminated by moonlight. Catelyn lay and did not sleep. Her hand found the rush ring where she had tied it, and she touched it as she had touched hair she'd cut from her sons' heads when they were small, fiercely in secret, as if the touch were a contract. She did not pray, not in the way that looks a certain direction. She let the river do the praying for her. It hummed a note she knew now, a deep wordless thing, and she matched her breath to it and felt her body agree. She was alive. Death had been interested in her, and then Rilla's rough hands, and the willow's rude hair, and maybe something stubborn in her bones, had made Death decide to look elsewhere for a while. She fixed in her mind the shape of Robb's hand when he had learned to hold a quill, and the way Arya had chewed the ends of her thoughts, and the line of Sansa's neck when she had looked out a window at something she had not yet learned to name. She held Ned's voice inside her like a candle cupped in a careful palm. She did not ask for mercy. She asked, without words, for time, which is another word for mercy and a harder one. When morning came, it came the way it always does, without regard for the dead. Brienne was already awake, and had found a sprig of something with small blue flowers. She held it with the wonder of a warrior who has never quite learned who grows the food she eats. "It's pretty," she said, almost apologetic. "It smells like the comb the stable girl at Evenfall used sometimes when she thought no one was watching." Catelyn took the sprig and pressed it to her nostrils, and smelled clean and sweet and something old, and then tucked it into the binding at her throat as a small defiance against ugliness. They ate bread and a piece of cured meat that had decided to be mostly salt, and called it breakfast. Podrick told a joke about a hedge knight and an ox that would have made a boy at court snort, and a woman like Rilla snort harder. It made Catelyn's eyes water, which was good enough. They set out again, not in a column, but in a companionship that knows not to walk in a line where men with bows hedge the path. The path bent toward a village where, it was said, a woman had taught children to write messages in mud and send them downstream, only to have them found by a miller's widow, who preserved them on bits of fired clay. The messages were small, desperate, domestic, human. "The bread is gone. He did not come back. I have 3 hens. I have 2. The world is strange. It takes and leaves both." Catelyn felt herself growing, not back into the lady she had been, that woman with the river-colored eyes and the hope that men who made oaths would keep them, but into something else that answered to the same name and wore its grief like a wet cloak and did not mind the weight. At a fork in the path where someone had carved a fish into a birch with a dagger, because men must always carve and leave evidence of having been, Brienne touched Catelyn's elbow. She did not often touch unless told. She looked past the trees toward the west. "I heard," she said, awkward, as if the words were too small for what they carried, "that Lord Edmure is a prisoner. That river run is tied up tight. That your uncle slipped. They say the Kingslayer." She bit the inside of her lip as if the taste would help. "They say many things." Catelyn inclined her head. The leather at her throat creaked, a tiny familiar sound. She wrote on the slate, "We will not go to Stone yet. Stone is hungry and patient. It will wait. We will make the river our hall. Our bannermen will be women with baskets and men with sore feet, and boys who know which frogs sing at which hour." Brienne read, and something like joy that had been made to sit in the corner all day was allowed to stand a moment in her eyes. As the days turned and the nights cooled, the shape of what they were building began to be clear in outline if not in substance. They did not call it anything. Names are banners. Banners draw horns. But the thing drew anyway. Widows came with cords and rope and skill no man had asked them to show. Orphans who had learned to be silent learned again to speak in whistles that carried across water and meant wheat or men or danger or rabbit. Old men who had nothing left to carry carried news lovingly as if it were a child. They made a moving house from these bodies and these tasks. In it, Catelyn did what she had always done and hated and loved. She fostered. She taught. She corrected. She forgave less and forgave better. She wrote with chalk and mud and tied messages into the hair of girls who ran faster than dogs. Sometimes at dusk, by a fire that had learned to be small too, she remembered how to laugh. It sat strangely on her at first. Brienne was surprised, the first time the sound came, as if a hawk had flown out of Catelyn's mouth. Then Brienne laughed too, awkward and wholehearted, and Podrick followed with a hiccup that might one day be a man's laughter. On such nights, Catelyn felt the river breathe easier, as if pleased. On a night like that, in the shadow of an oak, older than any argument, a boy came running with his lungs scoring his throat, and his heels making promises to the ground that his legs could barely keep. He skidded and knelt, and pushed a little leather tube into Catelyn's palm. His eyes were huge. He stood and waited without panting. By sheer force, she unrolled it. The writing inside had been done by a hand used to being steady and taught to sway. It was a soldier's hand. The ink had bled where the leather had let in a bit of river. It said only, "Stone does wait, but not forever. Blackfish." Catelyn closed her eyes. House and river and stone are all family in the end. She could see Bryndon's mouth twist and his eye narrow against some remark made by a man with hair oiled out of respect for himself, and she felt both longing and caution rise. She wrote the reply slower. "Live. Make trouble. Send news. We are building a house out of mud and hands. It is colder than stone and warmer." She sent the boy back under the pines with the tube tied at his belt and his little chest swelling, because for an hour he was a raven that the wolves did not hear. When she lay down that night, the stars were a thin scattering and not much comfort. The river whispered. Brienne slept with her sword out of its scabbard and a hand on the blade as if to learn its temperature. Podrick mumbled something about stew, and then about honor. Catelyn stared at the black braid of the river through the leaves and counted the days like stitches on a hem. She had not let vengeance make her drunk. She had not allowed grief to make her incapacitated. She had turned them both into rope and used it to tie a knot around the throat of absence. It would not hold forever. Nothing does, but it would hold for now. When she slept, she dreamt of Winterfell, but not the Winterfell the singers described, not the Winterfell of banners and cold wind. She dreamt of the kitchens, where dough rose under cloth, and the smell of onions comes and goes like a cat. She dreamt of women's hands, dozens of them, chopping, kneading, washing, scolding. She dreamt of girls stealing taste with their fingers and old men arguing over salt. She dreamt of a space where things are made, bread, plans, destinies, and of the warmth such making gives off. She woke with that warmth in her bones and felt the chill of the river fighting it and triumphing, and then perhaps conceding a little too. The morning crackled with frost on the grass. Breath smoked. Ravens made their arithmetic in the trees. Rowans bent with berries like drops of coagulated blood. Brienne rolled her shoulders, set her mouth, and looked at Catelyn in that steady way that said, "I am ready to stand." Catelyn put her palm flat against her own belly, the old habit of a mother counting, and then turned toward the path that would take them past the place where Frey men forgot the song ropes, sing and down toward another village where the miller's widow had learned to fire clay, and into a future that was not a plan but a practice. The river went with them. It walked in their ankles and hummed in their throats. It muttered dissent when they considered haste, and approved in its watery way when they chose care. It is a thing that cannot be owned, only listened to. Catelyn listened. She had been a lady of rivers all her life, and had not understood the word until now, when it meant hunger and danger and dirty skirts, and the sound of frogs at 2 a.m, and the way a willow will keep your secrets if you throw them into its hair. She understood it now. She would make the land understand it again too, even if she had to spell it for it, letter by wet letter. And if, at times when the fire was low, grief rose up and demanded a sacrifice, she would offer it only the shape of her breath, moving in and out, stubborn as any vow. She would not give it her daughters or the children of other women, or the boys who had learned to read river marks. She would give grief the morning, and then she would take the afternoon back. That was the law she set within herself, and she meant to enforce it with a ruthless kindness that was colder than vengeance and more durable. By a ford that had forgotten its name, They met a woman leading a cow whose rib bones were a song. The woman's eyes were a city of their own, ransacked and still inhabited. She paused, looked at Catelyn's collar, then at Brienne's sword, then at Podrick's eager, clumsy hands. She nodded. "Are you the house?" she asked. Catelyn wrote, "Yes." Then she wrote, "Come in." The river made a small approving noise at the bank, like a mother agreeing that children can have one more minute in the water, because it is still warm. The house that was not a house, and the law that was not written, and the river that was not tame moved forward together, and what waited for them was not mercy, but something near enough to make a life.